Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another video about Dante. So if you did not know, I am running a Dante read-along. We are reading the Divine Comedy across 3 months. So we will be reading Inferno across the month of April, Purgatorio across the month of May, and Paradiso in June. And I thought to kind of kick off this read-along, it might be nice to do a video kind of commemorating all of the translations that Dante has gotten over the years. And if you are somebody who is debating which translation to get, I hope this video kind of inspires you. I am in no way going to be able to go over all of the English translations in this video. And of course, this doesn't even touch onto translations into other languages. So I'm going to focus in on a few, and these are the few that I have read a pretty great deal of. So I feel confident that I can talk about their strengths and weaknesses to a certain extent. But of course, as with everything in terms of translation, a lot of this is going to be up to you personally. Now, Dante has a very interesting history of translation into English, and he has very many translations. I mean, so many into English. So there is definitely a translation out there that I think will work for everybody. And again, it's going to be totally personal. So the 4 that I am really going to be talking about today will be Mark Muse's, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's, Dorothy L Sayers, and the Hollander translation, which actually has the parallel text in Italian on the opposite page to their English translation, which makes it a really interesting edition, though I've heard there are far better dual language editions out there. So Dante lived in the late 1200s, early 1300s. And so when he was living, there wasn't what we might think of as the modern Italian language. And actually most things when they were written in Latin. And so Dante is a little bit of a rule breaker here because he decided to compose the Divine Comedy in the vernacular. So in the language spoken by the people, but what language he was writing in and what language he would have been speaking, I think we might want to term Tuscan. Tuscan kind of existed as its own thing for a long time, but people like Dante, Boccaccio, and even later kind of Florentines like Machiavelli and Guicciardini, they kind of decided to write in the vernacular largely because of Dante. But when they were writing in this language, it became far more universal across kind of the boot of Italy, let's say. And so in many ways, Tuscan, or the language that Dante was writing in, formed the basis for what we think of as the modern language of Italian. And so I have a question for those of you that are Italian. Do you read at all kind of an updated version of Dante when you study Dante in school? Do you read maybe a more modern Italian version of the text rather than the traditional kind of medieval Italian or Tuscan version that he originally wrote in? Because I know in English, people are of two minds about this a lot. Probably, let's say Chaucer, I would say Chaucer is probably a good equal to Dante in terms of time period, writing far enough back that the language he was writing in feels kind of clunky, feels very foreign to us in the modern day. And there are actually modern English translations of Chaucer out there that students will use. Other students will read Chaucer as he is, and it certainly can be done. So I was kind of wondering what the Italian perspective on things is. Do you ever want to read an updated translation, or do you try to stick to it pretty purely in the way that Dante wrote it? Because I think that's really fascinating. I, in general, think translation is incredibly fascinating because people often argue about translation, and this goes specifically for Dante, but it can go for any kind of translated work. There are Dante scholars out there who will tell you they firmly believe the Divine Comedy cannot be translated into any other language than Italian. They think so much is lost in translation that it's really hard to translate Dante properly. And I think you will see that when you decide to pick up different translations of Dante. I think you will see different variations on the same thing, but they seem wildly different. And so that's why certain translations appeal to certain people. And that's why, too, it's kind of hard to review something like Dante that you're probably reading in translation, because in a case like that, you often wonder, am I not clicking with Dante, or am I not clicking with the translation. So I struggle with this a lot with Russian classics. I don't really think there have been many English translations that are truly spectacular because I often feel like if I read one translator across multiple works in Russian literature, I feel like I'm just getting them. I feel like there's no variation in the writing between Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. I am reading the translator, and so that's something that's really interesting, and it's something to keep in mind because if you don't like Inferno, for instance, maybe you don't like the translation. Now, those of you who are Italian or who know Italian, you're in luck because you're just going to be spoiled. You can read it in the original, and you will have to tell all of us what exactly we're missing out on. It's been my dream for many, many years to kind of learn enough Italian to be able to read Dante in the original. And I've heard it's a very difficult thing to do. So if you feel like a whole lot is lost in translation, if you are Italian and you've read it both in the original and in English or in any other translation, what do you think has been lost? Has anything been lost? Because I definitely feel like I really love Dante, and I see Dante in all of these translations, but certain translations work better for me than others. The first translation of Dante's Divine Comedy into English was done by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in the 1800s here in America, and that has remained a perennial favorite for many people, and it is absolutely stunning. It really, truly is. And Henry Wadsworth Longfellow went through a lot to make sure that his translation saw the light of day. There was actually quite a bit of drama around translating Dante into English because there was a lot of conversation around the imagery, specifically in Inferno, in these kind of puritanical circles, in Protestant circles, kind of discussing a Catholic work like this. So a lot of work went into his translation that makes it really a feat of literature in its own right. This is not the one I recommend starting with, though it is the one that I kind of wish I was reading for this read-along because it is so utterly beautiful. But I think the thing is that some people will find the poetry of Longfellow himself to be a little bit convoluted and to require a little bit more of your brain. So when you are reading Dante in Longfellow's translation, you are not only reading a medieval work of epic poetry, you were also reading a work of 19th century American poetry. And so there is an added layer of difficulty to it if you are not somebody who really likes poetry, or if this is your first time reading Dante. In my personal opinion, your first time reading Dante, you probably want the meaning more than you want the beauty. And that's hard for me to say because I read poetry primarily because it is beautiful, and any translation of Dante will be beautiful. There's a lot of beauty in the Longfellow translation, and I've dipped in and out of it many times over the years, and I would love to read it in full. It is just absolutely stunning, but as a beginner, I don't know that it's the one I would suggest you choose. Another perennial favorite for many people is Dorothy L Sayers' translation of Dante. Dorothy L Sayers is famous as an author in her own right, and she is a really fabulous scholar as well, and she put a lot of work into this translation. And for years, her translation has been the Penguin version of Dante. I find the Dorothy L Sayers translation unfortunately clunky. I think it is very weird. I think it is very strange. And I think it loses a lot of Dante by her trying to conform to his style. So the interesting thing is, when Dante was writing the Divine Comedy, he wrote it in a very interesting rhyme scheme that is apparently incredibly hard to replicate in English, and that's why you will likely very rarely see it replicated except in something like Dorothy L Sayers. So the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C. So the middle line of the previous stanza dictates the rhyme scheme, basically, of the next stanza. And so it's a very complicated thing to do in English. It really is. Dorothy L Sayers tries to do it, and I don't know that it's necessarily successful. I think that she tries so hard to cleave to that she loses quite a bit of meaning along the way. But I am the odd man out here. So many people love her translation. For a lot of people, it's the only translation they've ever read and that they ever will read. They love it that much. For a lot of people, Dorothy L Sayers was their gateway to Dante. And because of that, I'm inclined to believe that it's a personal thing for me, that I personally just don't get on with her translation of things. as many people who love her and who love this translation, they can't all be wrong. And so if this is the one that you want to go with, I think it's a pretty solid option. It's just not one that works well for me personally. We then have the translation by Robert and Jean Hollander, and this is one that's dual language, so I'll show you an example of that. On the left-hand side, we have the Italian. On the right-hand side, we have the English. A lot of people love these editions. A lot of people hate them because they feel like this kind of disrupts the flow of the poem because you're constantly flipping the page. You never look at the other side unless you're really interested in that, and some readers are not. And so whether or not you like that is, again, a personal choice. So you may very well want to have the Italian alongside it, especially if you have a knowledge of a Romance language or Latin. You might find it very interesting. What I will say for this translation is that I think it is functional. I think it's decent. I think it's fine. I don't have any real complaints about it, but I don't think it has the best flow, if that makes sense. I think certain translations of Dante have a real flow to them. Longfellow's definitely does. My personal favorite, Mark Muse's, does, and the favorite of many scholars, many professors in particular, Alan Mendelbaum's, also has a really beautiful flow to it. It really does feel like poetry. I think sometimes you're reading this and you think to yourself, yep, this is a translation, because you can tell they struggled for a second. But for your first time with Dante, I think you could do worse. Last but not least, we have the only translation of Dante that I have read in full, and that's Mark Muse's, and I just really, really like this. Mark Muse also translated La Vita Nuova, which is another set of poems by Dante, and I think is very valuable to read alongside the Divine Comedy, and so often editions of his work, such as In the Portable Dante, will include La Vita Nuova, and so you can get everything in one. So there's a lot about this that is really functional and really useful, but it also has a lot of really wonderful language. It does not sacrifice beauty for functionality, in my opinion. There are a lot of really stellar quotes from the Mark Muse translation. This can also be said for the Alan Mendelbaum. I don't have an edition of that, and I haven't dipped in and out of it as much as I have some of these others, so I don't feel quite so comfortable telling you its weaknesses. I do know, though, that most people tend to really like it. Alan Mendelbaum's is the one most universities will suggest you start with. It's the one my professor suggested you start with, and I went rogue. But I do kind of agree that from what I've seen of Alan Mendelbaum, he is a really wonderful translator, and he's a great place to start with Dante. But I have a real fondness for Mark Muse that is very personal, because this is how I fell in love with Dante. I fell in love with Dante through his translation. And so this is a case where the translator and the author are actually married for me. Mark Muse and Dante are inextricably linked in my mind, and I don't know that I would have fallen in love with Dante so hard had I read it in a different translation for my first read. And so I have a lot of fondness for the Mark Muse translation. And I thought what might be nice is if we could do a comparison of the first lines of each of these translations, and you might can decide from that alone which one speaks to you. And that's generally my advice for most works of translated literature. For somebody like Dante, there are so many translations into many, many different languages. And speaking more broadly, classics have been translated likely multiple times into different languages multiple times. So my advice is really to go to your library or to your local bookstore, go to the Dante section, pick up every edition that you can find, lay them all out on a table, read the first page of each. You will know by the end of the first page which translation you want to go with. And I think that goes more broadly for works that are translated in general. If there is more than one translation out there, I think it would behoove you to read the first page of each and see if you like the flow, see if you like how they're doing it, because often we forget about this when we're reading a work that has been translated into our own native language. We forget that the translator does put their own spin on things. We're not just reading Dante. We are reading Mark Muse. We are reading Longfellow. And I've heard quite a bit from international reviewers who can read in multiple languages that often they will read a classic that has been translated into English, before they will read it translated into their own native language. So in so many ways, this is all personal to the reader. It shouldn't be difficult. Dante should not intimidate you. There is a translation out there. I guarantee you, there is a translation out there that will make this very easy and digestible for you. Because I think there is an intimidation factor with Dante in any classic of this period that is poetry, and then it is Italian poetry, and then it is Italian poetry of the 1300s. And so there's a lot of kind of intimidation around the age of the work, the fact that it's written in poetry or verse. And so a lot of people, I think, get hung up on that. But a good translation should kind of make all of those concerns fall by the wayside. In fact, they should actually make all of the things that made you intimidated by Dante, a good translation should make those things exciting. So let's start with Mark Muse. Since that's the one I'm holding, I will read the first couple of stanzas of the Inferno. Midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path. How hard it is to tell what it was like, this wood of wilderness, savage and stubborn. The thought of it brings back all my old fears, a bitter place. Death could scarce be bitterer. But if I would show the good that came of it, I must talk about things other than the good. Here are the same stanzas from the Hollander translation. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Ah, how hard it is to tell the nature of that wood, savage, dense, and harsh. The very thought of it renews my fear. It is so bitter death is hardly more so. But to set forth the good I found, I will recount the other things I saw. And the same stanzas from the Dorothy L Sayers translation. Midway this way of life we're bound upon, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, where the right road was wholly lost and gone. Ay me, how hard to speak of it, that rude and rough and stubborn forest, the mere breath of memory stirs the old fear in the blood. It is so bitter it goes nigh to death, yet there I gained such good, that to convey the tale, I'll write what else I found therewith. Last but not least, the first few stanzas from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's translation. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say, what was this forest, savage, rough, and stern, which in the very thought renews the fear. So bitter is it, death is little more. But of the good to treat, which there I found, speak will I of the other things I saw there. I would love to hear your thoughts on translation in general down below. When you read a work that has been translated into your native language, do you often feel like something has been lost in translation a little bit? If you have read any of these translations of Dante, or you have another favorite, I would love to hear about that down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.